Mild disclaimer, I am the kind of person who watches videos at 2.5x, so I will talk fast. You can, please interrupt with clarification questions. There's a decent chance that if you have, a critique of the things that I'm saying, strategy-wise, that I will address that later in the talk. If I don't, then I'm going to try and have lots of time for questions at the end. But I will start by highlighting that you could imagine 3 things that people have written about at different times. Either how do you make sure that people ordering DNA sequences from 100 different companies for different parts of a dangerous genome, or how do you actually verify that the politician's team giving proof of life photos are giving real proof of life photos, or having agent-agent interactions where you can link the people's identity to the agents. These are things that people can identify. They, if done badly, or not solved at all, will start to seriously erode infrastructure as people use AI systems more and more often, and as the systems get more capable. The general solution direction that people often identify for something like this is, let's have a DNA or a DNS for people. The domain name service is how your computer knows that it is reaching the website that it thinks it is, and there's a substantial socio-technical amount of infrastructure behind this. And it's really hard to just snap your fingers and magic it into existence, but when you talk to a lot of people around things like biosecurity, they tend to assume this primitive already exists, or will exist in a timely manner. And if you look at what that solution would look like, people often either point to OAuth, and we'll just use login with Google. We'll use passports or mobile driver's licenses. We'll use something like WorldCoin. And the problems with these are that some of them are not socially load-bearing as identification systems currently. Some of them are poorly adopted and will be adoption limited, and some have multiple failure modes. And I think that it is very useful to be able to look at these types of things and say, what would the best solution look like if you were handed a blank slate? Banks have already solved all of those problems. The Know Your Customer laws require that banks confirm identity in a way that is societally load-bearing, has obvious key recovery, you go to the bank, and is incentive aligned, where if someone steals your driver's license, passport, and your credit cards, and you for some reason couldn't call the bank to cancel your cards because they stole your phone too, you're probably going to try to orchestrate replacing your driver's license and passport while in line at the bank. You want that kind of property for your identification system. And the question becomes, can we use this solution if you care about mitigating those downstream potential risks from AI? And the problem is that fixing this, trying to get banks to expose KYC to mobile wallets, is not anyone's job. There is no chance this will return the fund, so no founder should pursue it. The big companies will eat your lunch. The researchers, the big companies themselves, don't have an incentive to, or maybe don't realize that this is a new product offering they could expand into. There's no research novelty, so this isn't a research problem, and policy is going to be too slow. So I've been proposing that we should have field strategy as a new role where people come and actually solve this problem. And I know it is all fine and good to say, yes, propose a new role. I hope that you are all skeptical of me right now at this moment. This isn't a hypothetical. I have made 3 entities exist in this rough order of talking to experts, identifying where there is a gap, picking the person who I think is perfectly suited to fill that gap, handing them the problem, telling them about the solution direction, and I think for these 3 at least, I helped co-author their proposals to get funding to solve these problems. Each of them ended up getting their, I think the first check for each of them was over $1 million, and in terms of counterfactual impact, Jason Gross was doing MECINTERP research at MIRI. There were formal methods flavors, but he is literally the best person. I still believe that he was the best person in the world at that time to found a AI-first auto-formalization for a cybersecurity entity. I imagine at this point, many of you have heard of Theorem. Oath Technologies is a focused research organization that will be launching soon, and happy to go into more of like what Oath and Arundel are doing later if that is of interest, and or what my role was, but it might be also worth going into a bit of who am I that does this random stuff. I am not an expert in AI. My background is materials engineering. My PhD was in experimental quantum optics, and I basically have had one job wearing many hats at the biggest blockchain company you've never heard of, where I was the first PhD hire. I built out all the research infrastructure, and so that was how we structured our research programs, did hiring, made research grants to external entities. I led a special projects team that included David Dalrymple, Davidad, working on what became Safeguarded AI. I was in charge of the meta science team of how you use scientific processes to improve science as a system. And we had an internship program one summer that included Dwarkesh Patel. I ran a venture studio that spun out 5 companies to build mechanisms for various aspects of making it easier to fund public goods and commons. And then Davidad and Critch sat me down and I said, this seems like this AI stuff seems important. If you think I can contribute, let me know. I will quit and help with this. And they gave me enough of an endorsement and urging that I started Atlas Computing in summer of 2023. Most of what we've been doing until now was building tooling for formal methods. The field strategy stuff, those 3 entities that were started, those were all on the side. That was not my main job. It is becoming my main job. I am now building out a team to do this. The goal of this talk is to talk through why some of these problems are systematically orphaned and why you should care about these, why these may not sound critical, but I would argue they are. I'll talk through 2 examples of field strategy, maybe just one depending on time. I'm hoping to have a bunch of time at the end for discussion. We could even like whiteboard out, like if someone cares about a risk that they think is neglected, how would I apply field strategy to that problem? We can roll over a whiteboard or something. And then the 2 concrete asks on the final slide, because I am in fact scaling this. One of the reasons I would argue that there are overlooked problems is the law of the instrument. To VCs or startup founders, they assume there is a product that could solve this. And that may or may not be the case. Researchers will also assume that every problem would benefit from research, or the problems that they are best equipped to solve are going to be filtered through this process of, can I apply my tools to this? How can I make this better? This holds for traditional funders who issue RFPs, and then all of the applications they receive for their RFP are someone's passion project under a coat of the topic of the RFP. Having been a research funder, I speak from experience. And this holds for policymakers and standards bodies as well. This is the law of the instrument. Everything with a hammer, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so you should expect that in equilibrium, the problems, and I'll acknowledge we are definitely far from equilibrium, but in equilibrium, in a world like this, if most people are looking at problems that have certain properties, the problems that persist are problems that cannot be solved by solutions with those properties. I will also note that focused research organizations are another one of these types of entities meant to fill a gap. Atlas Computing is a Convergent research project, and you can ask me about FROs after if you are interested in that, what they are, etc. I will also claim that the survivorship bias holds for skill sets as well for an individual, and people who see a neglected, important, and tractable risk will often think, I will use my very particular set of skills for this. And the problem with that is that it is rare that the person who finds out about this does have the perfect set of skills to do this. Most kidnapping victims are not the children of spies. There's also my normal approach is useless here. I will learn, I will become an expert in this, I will become an expert in something else. And there's a risk of dramatically underestimating how hard that is. I did try to find a tweet that I remember Elon Musk reposting years ago, and I failed to do it, but it was basically saying the first step of solving any significant problem is dramatically underestimating how hard it is. And I totally hold that is true, and I totally think that you can have generalists go and solve those things, but the thing the generalist brings, in my opinion, is the ability to deal with uncertainty and pursue an important goal that, like, through a changing environment, when it is not clear what solved looks like, they just know directionally what the problem is. And so I have been trying to figure out what the best process looks like for an alternative to this. I have outlined it here. The first step is to start from, well, AI systems should probably be able to do some of these specific things. That will cause some risks to society. What would defensive equilibria look like that we could move society into in preparation for those risks? So that if that capability showed up, we wouldn't be worried about that capability anymore. And so I'll go into that, and then afterward go into a bit of, for each of those equilibria, what is an intervention that we could take? And then de-risking that, and what does de-risking actually look like, and how does that compare to the way other people use the term field strategy, and then why handoff is relevant. If you wanted to do this, I would say start from a victory condition. What would you want the world to look like? If you don't have that, there are so many normative or like value-based assumptions that one might have to make in order to sketch out what should you do. For those who are interested in like the philosophy side of that, Hume's guillotine or the Izot chasm is something that's worth doing a bit of reading on. The method that I advocate for is the tiling tree method, popularized by MIT neuroprofessor and the founder of Convergent Research. The example in this blog post is, let's start with how would you record the neural activity of a whole brain at a single cell resolution? Very hard problem, but you could theoretically say, there are criteria that would have to be true. We could split this problem space into things that are mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive at every level of a tree. MISI is this concept from management consulting that is like, you can cover a space and say like, well, either it's going to be, the recording will be digital or analog. And because this is never digital and digital, you know that that covers the space, and you can keep doing this until you break this down into a set of ideas. And the goal for this is not to be comprehensive. The goal is to surface something that is viable. And I think that that's like a very reasonable critique of like, well, anytime you apply an ontology, you're going to be wrong. And the goal is not to be right. The goal is to try and get inspiration to find more things, because if you go back to this, again, your goal for identifying defensive equilibria is to have enough that you can find one that's viable. And so you could ask, great, I don't care about neurons. I care about that AI systems should follow human instructions and not cause societal collapse. And I did a rough version of this where you first figure out, is it following anyone's instructions? Whose instructions are taking precedence? How are you deciding that? Is the user using this for intentional harm? How do you prevent that? Or are they causing indirect harm? How would you prevent that? There are many ways you could break this down. I tried to break it down so that the green boxes were roughly what subsets of the economy would you be modeling, because I think it's easier to deterministically forecast subsets of an economy rather than, for instance, like all the people in a location or all the people with a particular skill set, or like the hardware, like the data center and its supply chain or something like that. I will note that in terms of doing this kind of decomposition, there's a great, like the ASB's 4 pillars for bio does a really great version of this. And like whether or not he would agree that this is what he is doing, I think that it's a good characterization. I can point to a bad version that I did for cybersecurity in an evening, and you can split it into hardware and software and people. And like you ideally want the system to do only and exactly what it is told, like what it is told to do / what you think it should do. I think that this needs work, but you can use this to surface a bunch of things that are like, here are some specific things that should be done. What would it take to, for instance, make tamper security trustworthy, or have formal verification that was very easy to apply to a lot of different things? And once you go through this exercise, if there's interest, I can share links for, I think I have at this point over 100 different like scoped projects that match to one of these boxes. I also have one of these for epistemic security and could talk about that too. But once you have a list, there's a question of what do you do with it? And there is a very clear pattern that you can recognize in the AI safety and AI security space of, great, let's ask experts for neglected problems. Let's identify founders or general managers who can own those problems, and then we will have impact because the founders will solve the problem. And I don't want this to sound like a critique, because it's definitely not. The Peregrine Report is an example of doing this. They made it partway into step 2 before realizing like, hey, this is useful enough. We should just write up all of this stuff and have, I think, 208 expert proposals for reducing risk. I will note, I have done something very similar to this. I interviewed a lot of experts. I've interviewed also people from the defense community or intelligence community, and I can tell you, people get very excited about proposing ideas that are well outside their skill set. And a lot of those ideas are, unfortunately, really bad ideas. You can take that and bring it to someone who is an expert in those things and ask, hey, would this work? And the answer is almost certainly no. But the interesting thing is that you can ask, how would you change this idea to make it something that would work? If you shared the assumptions that I have and the concerns I have, what would you do on this? And it's a really good way to extract expertise in the world models that these individuals have about how the domain of their expertise is useful. And so rather than looking at just these, I would highlight that there are some other steps that basically no one does. One of them is when you have a list of good neglected problems, scope those down to identify very high leverage things that you can do rather than jump straight to it would be really great if. You can de-risk this with technical experts and say, hey, is this possible? Who would have to say, yes, this is possible before a skeptical grant maker would agree that this is something that is worth funding? You can also ask, who would have to adopt this before it would actually be useful, to the extent that humans are still the meaningful decision makers? Some human will have to do one thing versus another for there to be impact of some work. And you can also start identifying what are the relevant skills, because generalist founder or general manager is not a job description. You can write a job description for these things, and that will help you unearth who could become that founder or general manager. And then you can figure out why that person specifically, or someone of that archetype, might say no to this, and figure out what it would take for them to say yes. That's roughly this portion, or kind of that covers roughly to here some of the staffing. I will talk through one, if there is interest, talk through two. I guess I'm going pretty fast. Two different examples of this. The first one being that some people are worried that there is no oversight on model specs or the constitutions, and there's not really coordination. There's no loop back to there's no accountability. It can be changed. This could cause some concerns, for instance, from a government official who wants it to read differently. And if you don't have some sort of control mechanism or governance structure, it becomes very brittle to changes. And so you can start from that and say, let's identify some defensive equilibria. I think that the status quo of each lab running on their own is not really a robust one. You could imagine that a government body started doing coordination or mandating some aspects of these specifications. I think government doesn't move fast enough. You could imagine an industry body housing it, or something that looks more co-authored, something collaborative between the labs themselves. And if you were to pick this last one, then the question becomes, how would you go about actually manifesting that? You need to know what good would look like there, but also it is usually not something, these aren't things you can jump from A to Z on. And so the question becomes, what does B look like? And you can identify some potential interventions. Is there a narrow pain point that we could solve related to mental health risks or cybersecurity risks or concentration of power concerns? Is there something where setting up this entity actually makes life better for the frontier, the participants you would need, in this case, the frontier labs, based on what the defensive equilibrium was? You could say, you want to be able to come to them with, let me solve this problem for you, not, please would you do this, because it would be good. I think that you can always tack on to the first one, and it would be good, but getting to this will solve a problem for you, I think it should be modeled as opening a lot more doors. The next step would be drafting a Google Doc that can be socialized with these people, with the relevant people, and say, like, hey, if you're worried about concentration of power, this is a thing. Like, if you're worried about government intervention, to say, like, this is the thing that, like, the way we are going to add things to the model spec to make sure that, ChatGPT 6 is highly aligned with US government interests. There's, like, ask them, if you were worried about this, what would you do? Is this a direction that would solve a problem for you, potentially? How would you change it to make this useful, palatable, adoptable? And iterate on that. You can ask also experts who have set up governance bodies like this. You could ask antitrust counsel, why would the most scrutinized companies reject this? Can you change this so that it would be more viable? Can you make this look like a PR win for the labs that participate to add a carrot to the stick? I would say that in a lot of strategic work, it is very easy to fall into what is called hope chess in the chess world, where you are assuming or expecting that your opponent will not play optimally. And I think, or that things will happen to work out based on your plan. And I think it is much easier to succeed if you are modeling everyone as capable people who are appropriately overwhelmed by information, constrained by incentives, and things like this. At the end of, another thing to do is map out who would have to say yes to this for it to work. And if you can get conditional commitments from everyone, I would say that this becomes the best possible artifact you could have at the penultimate step of field strategy. You want Frontier Labs saying, like, yes, if this legal entity existed and there were a person with, who matches this profile, if that person were signed on, we would be able to join. And if you can get that commitment, even for a very small thing, you can build off of that. And you want to get that for as many, all of the stakeholders. I think that the notion of an adoption quorum will be better fleshed out in the second example. But there's a sense in which the conditional commitments solve the bootstrapping problem, because you can also get that from the possible founder you would get to lead this, which is step 4, which I will cover after the second example because it's the same for both. Yeah, that's what I wanted to cover there. The second example could be something like, we would want to be able to verify that a data center, it's very plausible that we could, in the future, want to verify that a data center is only being used for inference or only being used for alignment research. And there are choices around, policy choices, for instance, that would be dependent on how costly that is perceived to be. If this looks like it would require years to set up and would not be very reliable, that might be something that doesn't happen. If this is viewed as something that could be, at this point, a software update and be doable within a week, that seems like it would be much more likely for the human decision maker to say, oh yeah, okay, let's actually try to enforce this. And so the question becomes, how would you have an equilibrium where we're looking for, where it becomes very easy to choose to require restrictions on how much compute is being used for things other than inference. And you could break this down roughly into, well, people check the machines directly, people check the machines with existing trusted machines, which would be like satellite or telemetry directions, or people build new trusted machines and put them into the data centers. And I think that the last one is by far the most reliable, is really the only thing that would meet the level of security requirements. There might be other defensive equilibria here that are worth digging into. I would love to hear what they are. But if you started with that last one of, great, let's look at workload attestation on chip. Let's assume that there's some kind of thing you could leverage to get cryptographic attestations that this exists. Does this look like we're trying to update the hardware itself and get NVIDIA to change what they're doing? There are people at OpenAI who could make asks of NVIDIA to change the hardware they're deploying if it has certain criteria. What are those criteria? I don't actually know what those criteria are, but I have a sense of the rough boundary, and a field strategist should be trying to figure that out. There's also questions of, can you bolt on new hardware? Could you add something like a verifiable network monitor to check these things that were tamper-proof? And then there's a question of, should we just try and do the best we can with software? And I would say that I've spent a decent amount of time thinking about specifically the first option. I have been increasingly talking to people about the other two as well. But if we dig into the first one, you could see something like 3 relevant ways that might get adopted. One of them is there are actual economic incentives that, for instance, data center providers have for providing the kind of security guarantees that would be exactly what you would want for verifiable monitoring. This would look like formally verified isolation of processes so that on the finance side, you know that your agents can't modify the billing. But on the verification side, you would have, so that you know that the agents or the other applications can't modify what they are seeing in terms of monitoring various agent processes. That is very separate from the adoption path of a government requirement. If you could get something that looked like signaling of a government requirement, then you could possibly get meaningful changes to hardware. But that is a very different incentive problem, a very different adoption quorum. And the last one would be, that I've identified, would be Frontier Labs saying that they want to adopt this. They will require this of their inference data centers so that they can coordinate with each other in a trustworthy fashion. Any one of these quorums is needed. It's not clear to me which is the closest to yes. And so trying to figure that out is something that is necessary to get adoption, and also something that is very hard for the models to do today. And so a significant amount of the actual human labor of field strategy is first, small part, use the AIs to identify these and identify the people and what their incentives might be, and then go talk to those people about what their incentives actually are, or hire people as field strategists who have been in those areas, who know what their incentives actually are and can model them well or get them on the phone very quickly. The other half of this is the technical de-risking half, which might also look like a Google Doc that you socialize with various people. In this case, this is for an advanced marker commitment for formally verified AI containment for cloud infra providers, starting at the hypervisor and verifying all the way down to the gates, and saying there should be a tool that has these properties, and if it had these properties, we would pay this much for it. That's the advanced marker commitment side. I have actually gotten positive feedback from a distinguished engineer on the security side at GCP and a relevant VP at AWS saying, yes, this is a good idea. There should be something like this. Currently in the process of tracking down the relevant person at Azure. The goal would be to put them all in a room and say, can we agree on something? Can we use philanthropic funding to incentivize or to subsidize the existence of this tool, because there are enough startups out there that would build this, and enough contractors who would build this tool if they knew exactly what it took to get adoption by CSPs, that it feels like having this coordination problem solved of what needs to be done, what is the product requirements doc for this thing that does not yet exist, that being able to have this to coordinate around seems like a meaningfully missing part. The last step is to go and staff this problem. I claim that field strategists are different from founders meaningfully in that they will they will do much of this strategy that makes it easier to find a founder, makes it easier for a founder to start, and succeed, and then hands it off and does this again, because this is a skill. When you're trying to staff the problem, you should ask what skills are needed and write the job description. You should figure out what the day-to-day work of the person doing this thing looks like, and then go find out who in the world has a job where their day-to-day looks basically the same. This is one of the most interesting learnings from Convergent research. The focused research organizations, there are like 12 that have been started, and for almost all of them, I think, it's about 20% people who are like visionaries and 80% people who have been doing almost exactly the same thing for the last 10 to 20 years of their career and are now doing it in a meaningful, in a different context towards a new end, but the work itself looks very much the same. Their expertise as like a scientific hard vacuum technician engineer is like the only thing that is relevant, and they're like, you need that expertise to just import. And I will claim that if there is something a person can do, there's almost certainly someone in the world. I will claim it is probably easy. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remove the qualifiers, and they just come so naturally. I think anything a person can do, someone out in the world is getting paid to do professionally. The world is big and weird, and that like there will be someone who is getting paid to do that thing. And the goal becomes find that person, find the best person there, find out why they aren't working on this problem and why they wouldn't say yes if you gave them all of the progress you have. I would say the founder is daunting in ways that being able to take on this thing that a field strategist has really evolved and gotten all these conditional commitments on is very, like, founder is daunting in a way that that is not. And I think that it is very compelling to be on the other end of a call where someone says, somehow, without your knowledge, you have become the perfect person to run this effort. Do you want to do it? I can give you all of these things, but I cannot do this work myself because I do not have this expertise. You are one of 4 people in the world who seems to have the relevant expertise, and you are the first person I'm talking to. I will claim that I am deeply skeptical of anyone who comes with a panacea and claims to be able to solve all problems. There are obvious limitations to this. The first one being, if you don't know what good looks like, this does not work. So specifically, if there's a ton of uncertainty, like alignment research, I don't know what good looks like, I don't know what done looks like, I can't run this process on this. If you have something that is more deterministic, or where it is very costly to do this iteration, it is very hard, if possible at all. And also there are instances where I think you do need a unicorn generalist founder who may not exist, just because this is a way of identifying possible ways to solve a problem also doesn't mean that there is a possible way to solve the problem, which I think is a corollary to the there's no rule that says we make it. But there are also some nice properties of this process. Specifically, that these interventions become, by construction, the best intervention, the best ways we have come across as a field strategy organization to solve this problem. If at any point an expert had said, that's dumb, you should be doing this instead, the obvious response is, well, if you had these constraints and this goal and these assumptions, how would you solve it? And then make them basically do your job for you, and they will be proud to they'll be proud to disabuse you of your ignorance, and maybe they'll want to continue doing so, and eventually you may have someone who feels a justified and large amount of ownership over the solution that has been designed. And people often have the concern of like, well, great founders don't want to be handed the solution. They want to have some sense of ownership over developing that solution. It turns out that if you've been chatting with the same person for 3 months as you've been scoping this and de-risking it, they will probably have a lot of ownership over that solution direction. And if you ask them, like, actually, hey, what would it take for you to say yes to running this? Would you, like, is there an amount of money or support or ownership or de-risking that would make this something that you said, yeah, I will leave this job, like I will leave my current job to do this because it's gotten over the line. Where is that line? Worst case scenario, they will tell you there isn't one, but usually putting them in the mindset of solving this as a problem, where they're like ends up making them negotiate against their status quo in favor of changing. So lots of framing type questions like this. There's also a nice feature where picking the cause area and scoping the interventions and executing are separated, which means you get specialization of labor, you have increased talent pools that you can draw from, and I think that for those who, in case there's a governance nerd here, I have some issues with futarchy, but it's this notion by Robert Hanson that you should have lawmakers who are proposing goals and then prediction markets that decide on which policy best achieves those goals. I love that this separates the dual mandate of governance, which is to decide what good is and then pick the path that best achieves it, which are currently totally mixed up now with both grant making and with policy making. But if you separate out the field strategy half, then it achieves the same separation that futarchy has. And so in terms of widening the talent pool, I think that there are relevant skills for field strategy, being able to find out who the relevant decision makers are, being able to get into the room, being able to persuade them, model their incentives, things like this, experience in the relevant industry. I'm pulling from think tankers who are frustrated by finishing the white paper, management consultants who have now made their money and have a lot of experience in boardrooms and want to put that to a good cause, people in government who might be frustrated by policy swings or limits of existing state capacity, or people who are former founders, particularly people who are maybe less good at or excited about execution, but are really interested in the strategy side and really want to work on having impact. Happy to announce that we are doing this as a combination field strategy incubator type structure where there are founders that focus on exactly one problem and see that until it leaves Atlas, as well as field strategists who work on multiple problems in parallel and focus on handing off. But these will be people in the same room who are using the same have access to the same professional network, using the same internal agentic processes and workflows and tools that I'm also happy to chat about in the Q&A section. And I am actively hiring for both of these. And so my two asks would be, if there are problems that you're coming across that you think researchers are trying to solve that shouldn't be research problems, or that you might only know about as researchers but can't be solved realistically by research, I would love to hear what those are. And also, if there are people who shouldn't be researchers or aren't researchers who would be interested in doing field strategy, I would be very interested in that as well. I have some candidates who are fairly far along in the pipeline, who I'm very excited about bringing on, mostly with experience in the intelligence community or the defense community or policy worlds. And I think that pulling people with more familiarity in networks at frontier labs or in the safety community would be very exciting to me. And this is a link to both the slides and the job description. Happy to share anything else, and I think I have about 20 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan.
Yeah, so I guess, thanks for the talk. I guess I'm trying to position this within my sort of like mental map of the general AI safety ecosystem. Should I be thinking of if this is like maybe a slightly more centralized approach to determining what organizations should exist? Like, is that a reasonable framing?
Yeah, I think my hesitation comes from the fact that I am less opinionated on whether or not a risk should be addressed, and more opinionated on, given a risk, how should it be mitigated? And so I'm happy to, there's there's an interpretation of this, which is it's a very end-to-end-ish strategy consulting for philanthropic funders and foundations in the space, and also possibly governments. The part that misses is the extent to which the intervention should be developed before launching.
So is the idea, if I can just rephrase that, so is the idea that, like, I don't know, maybe coefficient giving comes to you and is like, we want to mitigate X risk, or like, I don't know, some farmers union comes to you and is like, we want more chickens or something, I don't know. But like someone comes to you with a goal, process gets completed, organizations handling that goal come out. Is like that the rough pipeline?
Yeah, I'm also happy to do like fractional pieces of this. I am chatting with someone at definitely I can like vaguely de-anonymize after the recording, but was asked like, what are the like plan C, plan D contingencies that and that's the like race to superintelligence or burn the lead scenarios. What are the things that should be done for cybersecurity in those scenarios? Assume like the forecasted timelines and those scenarios, what is worth doing, and try to get as close to these are fundable things, but also a lot of that quickly turns into, well, focus almost entirely on the decision makers, because if it is a technical problem, the assumption would be that an AI system, like a swarm of agents, will be able to solve the hardware problem or the hardware design problem or the software problem. And so like that would be one possible scenario, or being asked, I care about epistemic resilience. I want to prevent the decay of the use of AI or the improvements in AI from decaying human epistemics. What would it look like to do that, map that out, identify concrete projects that are useful? Those would be the kinds of things that, or those are things that are currently underway.
Thank you.
My sense is a lot of, or at least the examples you put on the presentation, and so I guess the loose vibe I'm getting is there's a lot of looking at problems where the lens is like, with more attention and more care, we can coordinate to some better outcome.
There's a high correlation between like, can a company, it's not a perfect dichotomy, but there are things that companies can solve and startups can solve and markets can solve, and there are things that are market failures, coordination failures, more on the like public goods and common side, but like security canonically is, and like rule of law are canonical public goods.
Yeah. And
so there is that kind of a split. I'm definitely not trying to solve all of the problems. I am definitely more interested in things that, I will say to the comment about animal welfare, I'm definitely currently only focused on AI risks. So there is some amount of that scoping. There's also things that don't seem like they're going to get solved on their own. There's definitely some non-trivial amount of what path are we on, what is likely to happen, with a healthy amount of epistemic humility around the belief that the world is very complex, or very chaotic in the physics sense, and it's hard to say like, this is definitely good and a silver bullet and will be the difference factor. I'm taking a much more defense in depth lead bullets approach, but it is largely, I think it should be assumed to largely focus on coordination.
Cool. So I have two other lenses I'd be curious for you to react to. One is like, it seems to me there's a bunch of what's up for debate right now is some question of like who decides, like who gets to have the power that AI unlocks. How do you see that as like fitting into a coordination problem lens?
So I will note that in the like protocol abs side, there's a non-trivial amount of like one of the mandates that I got was, Evan, build the best research grants program ever. And that turned quickly into, well, what does that mean? And I was told, go figure it out. And I landed on more, better science, faster and cheaper. And faster and cheaper are pretty quantifiable. The other two are not. And so the only oracles you can have are people's opinions, and then you have to elicit and aggregate those opinions. And that's a lot of like computational democracy type things. This is the reason that I'm an advisor on the collective intelligence project. And like, I think the question of who should have access, power, control over, influence on, like my answer is very much informed by that, in that we should have representative systems in place to make those decisions. We don't have those systems in place. It is unclear what the best model of one of those systems is, but this starts looking a lot like the IAEA or FDA or Intelsat or like any of these other like organization bodies for AI. I think that the challenge here is that this is a place where one cannot help but be opinionated, because if you are going to say, here are N people with preferences over these K options, and you want to compress this down to the group has preferences over these K options, you have to do a lossy compression by a factor of N. And there are many ways you can choose what information you're throwing out, but saying we'll weight everyone equally is one choice. Saying we will weight by the amount of capital they have is another choice. There are mechanisms you can use to try and decide how to weight different preferences, allowing voice points. This is the quadratic voting pitch. But you have to make some assumptions, like you have to take a stance on normatively what you want it to look like. If you do that, and you end with like, Evan, there's a funder who wants a map of interventions for setting up this kind of representation, that is something that I could do field strategy on. It is harder to make the is-ought chasm that I mentioned earlier is this notion that you cannot derive logically statements about how the world ought to be or should be only from statements about how the world is. And so your question, I think, was framed of like who should have access, who should have influence. Those you cannot deduce from statements solely about how the world is, unless you start from some additional premise that says how the world should be.
Yeah, there's a lot of places we could go, and I don't want to monopolize the question, Mike. Like to get really concrete, for example, how would you think about doing field strategy around like, should we be trying to beat China, or should we be trying to like collaborate with them? Is it like you choose one of those frames and then you're like strategizing, or like how does it connect? So
if we speed back to this, the succinct answer is we would have a very long discussion about, or possibly very long discussion about what you are trying to achieve. Are there specific, like, is the concern a race with China versus the use of the use of AI as a weapon, or the lack of coordination leading to specific bad outcomes? And is coordination the best way to achieve that outcome? How to achieve that? I think that there are ways to creatively apply tiling tree approaches to surface things. And then the practice of de-risking or testing out which of those options is the most viable, I think maps pretty cleanly onto this. But I think at the resolution of should we pause and negotiate with China needs to stem from a in order to blank kind of goal. There's also a question from the chat that I can try and answer quickly. What are the most compelling examples of people doing field strategy before Atlas? I highlighted the ASB's 4 pillars. I think that's a good example. I think that I think usually this gets done by funders. Zoo, what was the organization that was doing in the UK? That, forgetting the name. That we like you pointed out as like, this sounds a lot like. Okay, I will try to remember. Not ARIA. ARIA is. I think that. I mean, there are the splitting of this between like pulling this out of the funder and pulling it, like separating it from execution feels novel, but obviously anyone who kind of systematically set out to do impactful things had to bridge this gap somehow. And so it would like, there are subsets of this process that you could easily argue every funder has done to some extent. And so it's a question of how structured it was. And another question of, will I be around for lunch? As yet undetermined, probably. I will, yeah. Let's say yes, I will be around for lunch. One last question?
Yeah,
we could split field strategy up into two halves. Into like one part is identifying the problem, scoping out a problem. The other part is going and just finding somebody who is a founder and who can go and execute and build really fast. Is there like some example of this being done before, for instance? Because it's easy to come in and say, oh, there's these two parts of the process that look very differently shaped, and we could sort of specialize it out and break it into two halves. And is it just sort of like, would you point at fundos, for instance? So,
sorry, you're thinking this split?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked, because I realized I forgot to say a thing. I expect both of these to have heavy field strategy characteristics. I plan to have/build and provide tools to do all of this stuff on, or to support this process of identifying and de-risking, and provide those to field strategists and founders. I think that there are two flavors of founders that I expect to have. One are going to be people who aren't committed to one particular solution already. They are more interested in the problem, and they know they want to run a thing, but they don't know what shape that will take, and they like really want to be on the execution side, but it's like it would benefit from some amount of de-risking, identifying of the relevant adopters before going and doing the thing. And then there's the version of founders who are people identified by the field strategists to run the thing, and they can, if they need a short-term home, come into Atlas to take over from the field strategist, get up to speed, and then be executing while their other entity gets set up.
Thank you, Evan, for coming out today.
Great. Thank you all for coming.